So last week was chapter 3. What was going on in chapter 3?
So King Xerxes had promoted Haman to be chief official above all other officials.
Yep.
And he asked that everyone bow down to Haman. And he was at the gates, Mordecai was at the gates, and he wouldn't not bow down. And so this enraged Haman, and he went to King Xerxes and told him about it, and not even that much about it.
Yeah.
But he just said that Mordecai, and it also went into that Haman was an Agagite,
Which is an Amalekite.
Amalekite.
Yep. Yep.
And then he asked that King Xerxes give him his signet ring and permission and a decree to kill all the Jewish people across the huge empire. And they cast lots.
Yes. For the day, for the month and the day. Yep.
Yeah.
That's right.
And it was like they had like 12 months or 13 months to gather them all up.
To make their preparations, whatever they're going to do, because they're going to annihilate the Jews in one day. Now, we talked a bit about the background for that. Why will Mordecai not bow down, and why is Haman's reaction so over the top?
He won't bow down because of the Jewish, but because specifically with him being an Amalekite, he would have bowed down to him as an act of worship to somebody that they should have taken out. And I believe he's a tribe of Benjamin, which was also, King Saul was a tribe of Benjamin that should have taken out and destroyed the Amalekites. So there's that kind of feuding there and on top of that.
Yeah. So there's been a long hostile history going back 1,000 years between the Israelites and the Amalekites because of an unprovoked attack against Israel by the Amalekites. And God had pronounced judgment on them, had said he was going to wipe them out. And when the time came, Moses said to the people of Israel, you need me to speak louder? Is that it? He said to the people of Israel, when that time comes, do it. Wipe them out. And Saul didn't. He didn't do it. And so here we are, 500 years after the time of Saul, and this conflict is coming up again. Because now here's Mordecai, who's connected to the same tribe and the same clan, who refuses to bow down to an Amalekite, and this is why Haman gets so angry. I mean, he could just take out Mordecai. Why not just take out Mordecai and be done with it? Because it's this conflict between the Amalekites and the Jews where Haman wants to make sure the Jews are wiped out. Now, there's some irony in that God had promised to wipe out the Amalekites and to preserve a remnant of his people. But right now it looks like what's going to happen is the opposite. Because it's an Amalekite who's in charge, manipulating the king to do what he wants. And it's the Jews who are now being threatened with annihilation, and it's supposed to happen in one day across the entire empire. And who can stop him? I mean, this is the thing that we've seen all through Esther, is who can stop King Xerxes? He does what he wants. He has absolute power. He has the kind of wealth and authority that nobody can challenge him. No one can stand up to him. What could they possibly do with a decree like this to wipe out the Jews?
Have God intercede.
Did you read ahead? Yeah. Okay, so let's look at chapter 4. So we're going to look at chapter 4, verse 1 through chapter 5, verse 8. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai, and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her, and he told him to urge her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the gold scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this?" Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king asked Esther, "Now what is your petition? It will be given you, and what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted." Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this: if the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." All right, so how does it open, chapter 4? What's going on in verses 1 to 3?
Mordecai mourns because he's read the edict and he knows this going to happen.
There really is nothing else to do, is there? I mean, I was thinking if we had something like this happen in our country, there'd be all kinds of things we could do. You know, you've got a Supreme Court, you've got referendums, you've got the Second Amendment, you've got all sorts of things. The Jews have no recourse at all. There's nothing that they can do to stand up to the king. They have no military, they have no power. And so Mordecai is mourning, he's tearing his clothes, putting on sackcloth and ashes, going about the city. But only as far as the king's gate. He can't enter the palace complex. Remember, he works somewhere there at the gates, but he can't go into the complex wearing sackcloth. But all across the empire, it says, all the provinces where this edict has gone, exactly the same thing is happening. All of the Jews are in mourning. They're all fasting and weeping and wailing, and a lot of them are putting on sackcloth and ashes. Because, you know, what else do you do? And I think there's, even though the author doesn't say it, what's the implication of fasting? For what purpose? To pray, right? So he doesn't say that they're praying, but that's why you fast. I think there is an implication underneath this, that what the Jews are doing is actually stopping to pray. They're fasting and praying. They're calling on God, even though he doesn't get mentioned. And why put on sackcloth and ashes?
Because it's a sign of humbling, and it's a sign of vulnerability and complete submission and surrender to the Most High.
Yeah.
That they put themselves in like a completely vulnerable, helpless state, imploring, begging that we need you. We have like a complete state of humility.
And I was thinking, when I read this, my first thought, if something like this were to affect me, is I would think rebellion. How do we start a revolt? Which, of course, isn't going to work with Xerxes, but that's just kind of where my head goes. What's their reaction? To humble themselves before who? And I was thinking too with Mordecai. Mordecai could have gone back to Haman and apologized. He could have been like, this is a little over the top. Can we work this out? I know this is really about you being mad at me, so maybe we could just sort something out here. Oh, no, that doesn't even cross his mind. Well, there's no way he's going to negotiate with an Amalekite. He humbles himself, but he doesn't humble himself before Haman. He humbles himself before God. And that's who they need to intervene for them, and that's where the humility is directed. Not toward Haman and not toward the king, but toward their God, who appears to be absent. But this is where their humility is directed, and this is what they're fasting and praying about, is that God will intervene on their behalf. Okay, now what does Esther do in verse 4?
She sends clothes out to him, but he refuses them.
Why do you think she sends clothes out?
Let's just go back to how it was, kind of thing. It's like,
She doesn't even know what's going on,
whoa,
right? I mean, she's in the palace. She's a palace insider. Nobody knows she's a Jew. So why would they tell her what's even going on? Nobody knows that it's relevant to her. So here she is in the palace. She's totally oblivious to the fact that this edict has gone out, saying that everybody, all the Jews in the empire should be wiped out.
So that reads a little further in, but so because of the response to the ones that are serving her, is it likely they were Jews as well, or they're just, she's so nice that we're on her side?
I don't know. I mean, we're not told anything about them, but it's interesting that she asks them to fast with her later,
Yeah,
isn't it?
exactly.
And you kind of think, what are those attendants thinking? They've got to know now something's up. They've got to know that she's Jewish. Maybe they, I don't know. But yeah, it's interesting that she even involves her own attendants in this whole fasting thing.
And his prior sending the clothes and he put it on so he could come in and speak with her.
I think so, yeah.
Without being dressed properly, he's not even allowed to come in.
Yeah,
And so she has no communication with him to
yes,
see what's going on.
right. So without having any clue, this is how she's, going to get to talk to Mordecai, is send some clothes out and maybe she's hoping then, okay, let's have a chat and find out what's going on. But when she sends the clothes out for him, what happens?
He refuses them.
Mm-hmm. He won't accept it. And so Esther then sends one of the eunuchs to go out and speak to him. So Mordecai's got all the information, which is really interesting because he knows everything. He knows why it's happened. He knows what's going on with Haman. He even knows the exact amount of money that Haman offered to put into the treasury for this. So Mordecai's got the inside scoop. But this eunuch goes out and they meet in the open square in front of the palace, and Mordecai gives him the whole story, gives him a copy of the edict. And then what does he say to this eunuch?
He tells him what he needs Esther to do, which is to go before the king and queen, the Jews.
That's right. Because unbeknownst to everyone except for Mordecai, there is actually one Jew in the empire who has access to the king, and that's the queen. So he says, tell her she's got to intervene. She has to go to the king and do something. Now, what does Esther do next in 9-11? What does she say?
Spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say that all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there's but one law, that he be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, so that he may live. And then she says, I haven't been called for 30 days.
That's right. So when Mordecai says you need to intervene and go talk to the king, Esther answers back and says, it's not that simple. This isn't a matter of just walking into his living room and saying, can we have a chat? Even though she's the queen, this is not a typical husband-wife relationship at all. She has her quarters, he has his quarters, and she only comes when she gets summoned. Haman has free access to the king because he's one of those advisors that can approach the king anytime he wants. But Esther does not have that kind of access to the king. And so for her to go unsummoned means she's risking death because the king can just say, off with her head. And she can put in a request. I mean, people could make a request to get a hearing with the king, and he could accept it, he could reject it, he could ignore it, but he's not on anybody's timetable. I mean, he could wait 6 months before he answers that. And the last time he actually summoned her was a month ago. So all that to say, does Mordecai appreciate the weight of what he's saying when he tells her to do that? Because it's seriously risking execution if she does what Mordecai says. It's kind of ironic, I think, that Vashti got banished for not coming when she was summoned. And here's Esther, who's going to risk execution by coming when she hasn't been summoned. But with Vashti in the background, you know how serious this king can be if the queen inconveniences him. And so Esther says, yeah, it's been a month, and if you want me to go in, this is what I'm risking. How does Mordecai answer that in 12 to 14?
Maybe this is the reason you are.
Yeah.
But I love too the part where it's like, he knows they'll be delivered. I love that it's like, do not think, like, God's deliverance is gonna come. You might not be, if you don't do this, you might not, like, this is probably your time and place, and if you don't go, but I love his sureness that a deliverance will come for us.
Yeah. It's interesting, he doesn't console her. He doesn't say, I know it's risky, but, and at the same time, you know that it's not that he doesn't care. He loves her like his own daughter. You know he would be devastated if something happened to her. So it's not that he's just taking this lightly. But he also knows the seriousness of the situations the Jews face, and the risk is a necessary one, and it's the right thing to do. And in one sense, Esther actually has nothing to lose, because if Haman has his way, she's going to end up dead anyway. And Mordecai just says it, just because she's in the palace doesn't mean she's safe. So if she's thinking she's safe because she's where she is, Mordecai says, don't think that. It'll come to you sooner or later. And that bit that you mentioned, Amy, is it's like the closest statement we get to any clear theology in the whole book. When he says, if Esther refuses, deliverance will come somehow from some other place. How does he know that?
He knows God will protect his people.
Because didn't God promise this? Like multiple times? There's an ancient promise standing in the background where God said he would not allow his people to be wiped out. And so Mordecai, without even any mention of God, where does his confidence come from? It has to come from knowing that promise of God that stands in the background that says he will not allow the people to be wiped out the way Haman intends for them to be. He will deliver the Jews somehow, whether Esther does what she should or not.
This reminded me of Abraham. Mordecai's faith reminded me of Abraham's faith.
You're going to have to explain that.
Well, just the faith that Abraham had when he was called to sacrifice his only son. And he went up the mountain and told the servant that we will return, knowing that God would provide a lamb to take the place of
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like how you pray and you know that what you pray for will already be given to you. Like it's that kind of unshakable faith that already trusts and depends completely in God for everything.
Not because you're confident in your agenda for God, but because you know your God, right? You know his agenda. We don't always know the agenda in the details. But if you know the God of Israel and you know the promises that are in the background, you can come to this with confidence that he's not going to violate his word. He's going to be faithful to what he said. And at the same time, Mordecai doesn't say, so your obedience doesn't matter. It does matter. What does he say about, her obedience if she chooses to disobey?
you and your father's house will perish.
That includes him. So here's Mordecai saying, he doesn't expand on what he means by that, but I think what he means underneath it is, look, if you choose not to be obedient right here, it might be that a whole lot of us get wiped out. God will keep his promise somehow, He will preserve a remnant of his people. But your obedience here matters, because if you don't step up, we're going to die. Like you and I, we're going to die. So her obedience matters, but it doesn't change God's faithfulness to his promise. So whatever the case, if she's refusing out of some sense of self-preservation, she's making a mistake. And then he says, maybe she's become the queen of Persia for just this reason and this time. That's as close as we get to a mention of God in the book. But that purpose, well, the world would say it's fate or destiny or karma. But when you know the God of Israel, you look at this and you think God has already orchestrated things the way that he wants. He has a plan in all of this. I was thinking too, just on the weight of what Mordecai says right here, that he's confident that God will accomplish what he wants with or without Esther. God doesn't need her cooperation to do what he's going to do. Whatever she does isn't going to thwart his plans or his purposes, but it will affect the outcome, the blessing or the judgment for her and her family. And this isn't the only place that happens. He says the same thing when he makes the covenant with David. He says to David that he will bring the Messiah out of his line, but his descendants, David's descendants, have choices to make about whether they're going to be obedient or they're not. Well, if they disobey, and Solomon does in a big way, that doesn't stop God from fulfilling the promise to bring the Messiah. But what it does do is it affects whether his descendants, whether David's descendants will experience blessing or judgment along the way. So disobedience has consequences, obedience has blessing, but God's plans go unthwarted. He does what he will do. Is that relevant to us? Why?
It's the same formula. We have to make those decisions a lot of times, and sometimes I succeed and sometimes I don't. But I've certainly experienced after the fact, well, I should have done that. I should have been my blessing. I could have been the one to help, I could have been the one to whatever, just knowing that I was being summoned by the Lord at that point. But I chose my momentary thing that I already had in my sight to override that.
And what difference does it make to know that your sin might have consequences for you, but it does not thwart God's plans? That's really important, because I've heard people say, I've heard Christians say, God wants to do all of these things in the world, but when people won't obey, he can't get done what he wants to do. No, like that's I guess a way that they motivate people to do evangelism or something, I don't know. But it's this kind of thing, like God's hands are tied by the disobedience of his people, because if we're the ones he's chosen to do his work and we don't do it, well, then God's just got to wait for us to show up, I guess. No, God will do what he will do. If he has to make the rocks cry out, if he has to speak through donkeys, he will do it. He will do what he's going to do. But our choice is not about thwarting his plans or purposes. He's going to be faithful to his word. Our choice is about, are we going to experience blessing or consequences along the way? Will we join him in his work and be obedient and experience the blessings that come with that? Because he's going to accomplish what it is that he wants. That's huge, because if you think that his purposes depend on your obedience, I don't know how you're going to sleep at night. Like, there's all kinds of stuff that's going to look horrible if his plans depend on you being obedient. He's going to do what he's going to do. And that should be a comfort for us, that the promises he has made do not get derailed by our obedience, but our obedience matters. It matters for Esther and her family, and it matters for us too. Okay, now how does Esther respond to that in 15?
She says to go back and tell him to hold a fast for me for 3 days and 3 nights, and eat nothing at all, and that she and her women will do the same.
Yes. It's a very sober response from Esther. She doesn't just say, okay, you win, I'll do it, wish me luck. Right? I mean, the fact that she actually says, okay, we're going to take 3 days to fast and pray about this. She doesn't say pray, but that's the implication. Means that she realizes if she's going to do this, she needs God to intervene on her behalf. And they are intentionally, again, humbling themselves before the God of Israel before she goes in to see the king. And then she says, well, what does she say at the end of verse 16? What do you think about that? What's your impression of that sentence?
She accepts her lot there, like, I'm gonna go, I'm gonna be obedient, and I'm gonna do what I have to do, but my life is not about you, it's my obedience to God, it's a prayer.
I don't get the sense that it's resignation. And, if I die, well, okay. I get the sense it's that she's looking at her situation and saying her life is dispensable, if that means salvation for the Jews. That she's willing to do this at the risk of her life because she thinks it's important. It also strikes me that she knows the situation really could go either way. That's really important. She doesn't know what God's going to do on the other side of this. So God doesn't have to intervene for her. Fasting and praying doesn't put people in control. And neither does sacrifice or anything else, as if there are certain things we can do that will force God's hand or make it so he has to respond this way or that way. He doesn't. And she knows that. If he's sovereign, he can choose to intervene or not. She's not going into this situation assured of what the outcome is going to be. She's going to do what's right, and whether or not the outcome is what she wants, she's still going to do it. It reminds me of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they're facing off against King Nebuchadnezzar, and he tells them to bow down, and they won't, and he's like, I'm going to throw you in this furnace, and they're like, our God can save us from that furnace, but even if he doesn't, we're not going to bow down. Do you hear just the humility in saying, my service to God does not depend on him promising me a good outcome. My service to God is because he's worthy of it, and I'm going to do it, whether the outcome is what I want or not, because this is the right thing to do.
And part of the purpose of fasting is emptying the self of self, and not eating for that long. Literally, you deny the self, and you are filled with the Holy Spirit. And so I love how she's the complete, she shows the ultimate goal of a fast is to submit the self and get rid of the self and all the self-will and anything, and to be filled completely with the Holy Spirit and with God's will, and in that obedience, showing that through that, and then taking that on to the point of death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is important because if you know how the story goes, we're going to get a happy ending. But there are lots and lots and lots of believers who are faced with this kind of situation, and they don't get delivered. So, is it worth it to trust God when on the other side of that might not be the physical deliverance that you want? Well, yeah, because he owns the other side of the grave too. And so it's just refreshing to have her, come with so much humility that she's willing to say, it's in his hands, and whatever he decides to do, he decides to do. But she's going to do what's right.
I think fasting also gives clarity of mind. You begin not to think your own thoughts, but the Holy Spirit, you're trusting and taking on his.
She's going to have a really shrewd plan by the time she gets to the second banquet. Yeah. I'm still thinking about the end of John, too. Just this with Peter. The fact that Jesus tells Peter at the end of John, this is how you're going to die. And Peter says, well, he has other things to say right there, but the fact that Peter knows that and he follows Jesus anyway. Isn't that the decision that all of us are faced with if we really take seriously the command to deny ourselves, take up our cross and follow Jesus? We don't get that. We don't get the same thing Peter does. Jesus doesn't tell us this is what the outcome is going to be for you. Here's where you're going to have success, and here's where you're going to have failure. Now you decide if it's worth it since you know what's coming. No, you just have to trust him and say, my life is dispensable for his purposes, whatever it is that he requires. And there might be success on the other side of this, and there might be death on the other side of this, but if he's conquered death, whatever it is he asks of me is worth it. I mean, what Esther did, what Peter did, that's what we all do. Because the ultimate, I mean, the cost is the same for all of us because the cost is ourselves. What that will practically look like will be different for each of us. But our faith is not in the outcome. Our faith is in our God, the sovereign God who controls everything for his purposes.
It makes, Jed had dog tags, and they preached with one of their names, and they had to memorize the verses, but it makes it like, this is your life. You will be still and know that I am God. Fear not, for I am with you. And so it says, be still, fear not, and then follow me. And it's like, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Which is what she had to do. She had to still herself, not fear, and then follow what God had her do.
What does it profit her to gain everything there is at the Persian palace and lose her soul? Yeah. I mean, this is a huge decision right here. This isn't just a matter of, will I step in on behalf of my people? This is a decision about whether she's going to identify with God and his people or the pagans and the Persian king. It's really a choice between God and the world right here. That's the choice she's making. And she does it. It's just amazing how there's just a depth of character in saying, I might die, but I'm going to do it because it has to be done. And you notice right here how Esther's role in the story starts to change. So up until this point, she's mostly just been doing what everybody else told her to do. But right here, she's the one who starts giving instructions. She's been passive all through this, but now she's the one who's going to take the action because she's going to identify with God and his people. So Mordecai goes out, carries out all of Esther's instructions, and then 3 days later, after the fast, what happens in verses 1 and 2?
Puts on her royal robes and goes into his palace and stands in front of the door where he has his son.
Yep, and waits.
Something that keeps coming to mind is in these 3 days, she's been preparing a banquet. I mean, that can't be an easy task, especially for the king. That just keeps coming into my mind on the 3rd day. How should we get this done? Well, she's got 3 days to do it because she invites him at that time, right?
Yeah.
To come.
Yeah, and they're coming the same day. Yeah.
That was something that just tried to get into my
Following
mind.
what you said, Susan, is that I find it fascinating how there is a feast after the fast, because that is how it always happens in liturgy. And that you have the Lent fast with the Feast of Easter. You have the Nativity fast with the Feast of Christmas. Every fast, almost every Christian fast, you have a fasting period followed by a feast, the Apostles' Fast, the Feast of St. Paul. And then here, you have a fast followed by a feast.
Though this feast and the second one are going to be... She's shrewd. Oh, man, is she shrewd, what she's about to do to the king. Well, yeah, we'll come back to that in just a second. So what happens after Esther approaches the king in verse 3? How does he respond to her?
He's pleased to see her,
Mm-hmm.
as compared to his other wife and to the Weva,
Yes?
who he summoned basically naked.
Uh-huh.
Wasn't pleased because she refused.
Uh-huh.
And here's Esther, who wasn't invited, but for some royal,
Yep.
to come and stand and he's pleased
Yeah.
to see her.
Yeah, and
Miraculous.
then what does he say?
He says, so Esther approached him, and then he said, what is it, Queen Esther?
Mm-hmm.
He's very generous to her.
Yeah.
What is your request? And here he is again. Even up to half the kingdom will be given to you. So he just lays it on, like,
He does?
because he's never very wise anyway.
No, he's not.
Either overly malicious or overly generous.
Yep.
There's nothing measured about this man.
That's right. You do get this sense, don't you, of just sort of overwhelming favor. You don't get the sense in anything he says that he's reluctant, that he's irritated, that he's impatient. It's just like, yeah, here's this king who's so unpredictable, and yet the way he responds gives you this impression like he is glad to see her, and he really is willing to do whatever she wants. And that phrase, when he says up to half the kingdom, that occurs in other places as well. It's not meant to be taken literally, but it's a figure of speech that just means he's willing to be very, very generous. So whatever it is that she wants, just lay it out. And yeah.
It's like King Herod said to Herodias.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's interesting, it's interesting to me because, previously, it's been 30 days since, so, obviously, to me, there was God doing work, because who knows if he was just distracted with things or what, or if he had 30 days ago had a tip with her, or she had done something to annoy,
Yep.
that's an entire month to pass where you don't see her, means that there was the potential of him having some feelings of not liking her.
Yeah. And he's even sober. You know?
Are you sure?
Well, no, but I assume if he was drinking, it probably wasn't while he was on his throne. But you never know, I guess.
And he just apparently just sits there on the throne.
Well, I don't know.
Watching the interest
I guess.
in her, so that I can either have her head or invite him in.
Yeah, I don't even know.
But she knows she was down to the nines.
Yeah.
She was lovely. She
Yeah.
made herself lovely.
Yeah. And what does she say when he's like, bring your request, tell me what you want?
But she's prepared to do it.
Yeah, and then what happens at the banquet?
What do you want? Another banquet.
That's right. So they're drinking wine. Well, it's not just the king who's there too. Yeah, so it's the king and Haman together. They're drinking their wine, and the king asks her again, what do you want? It'll be given up to you. It'll be given to you up to half the kingdom. And then she says, another banquet? So come again to the second one, and when you come to the second one, you and Haman, then I'll tell you what I want.
I just find it so rich and royal, juicy, that he says, bring Haman so that Haman and I can do what she wants. What she wants is totally against what Haman wants. And I just think it's so perfect, bring him.
Yeah.
No idea. She's going to ask her exactly what Haman and want, and Haman is part of it.
That's right. That's
So
right.
then again, I go back to the preparation. She had to have these things prepared before she even knows. That's big.
But she's the queen. She's
No,
not
but
very
no,
much
but
off
she has to tell them, okay, we want this prepared. And so they prepare all this, and they gotta have it prepared the next day, and she's gotta have it,
She's got a plan.
she has,
She definitely has a plan.
And they all eat at the king's palace.
But this has gotta be special for banquet, right? I don't know, I just,
Probably not yard bird.
What's Esther doing here with two banquets? Why doesn't she just come out and say, just what I want?
Yep.
Huh?
Fatten him up for the slaughter.
Well, and there's
Pretty
that
much.
there's that element of mystery, right? Like, it's like, she's enticing him with a little bit, like, whetting the appetite kind of thing. Like, come, we had a lovely time. So it's got him wondering, it's like that novel where you're reading and it ends with a cliffhanger, so you want to know what the next chapter is.
But it always strikes me that she's not a worldly woman. That all just points to God to me, because it's like, in and of her own resources, I cannot fathom that she would formulate such a plan. It's just like God had to direct that. How else do you even know to do that?
I still go back to the feast, the banquets. Maybe it's because doing that myself, I mean, I know that they're doing it. But she had to have just this faith, because think of if the king had said no, where's all that food gonna go?
Well, she's not gonna care. She'll be dead.
They didn't have refrigeration. No, they didn't.
For she also had a staff.
Yes, I know that. But still, do they say, okay, well, maybe we can take it to our friends? He said no, but I guess it all goes back to that inner faith she must have, that God,
Well, and think about what she's doing to the king right here. So
She's baiting him in.
she is. She's totally about, I mean, what do we know about this king? He likes his wine. He likes being wined and dined. He's got an ego. He's easy to manipulate if you know how to stroke his ego, how to get him interested and keep him interested. But here's the thing, if she wants to get this edict revoked, she's going to have to go about it in a way that the pride of the king reacts against Haman instead of against her. And she's got Haman there, why? Because she's going to ambush him right in front of the king. But the way that she's going about presenting this, the double hospitality, the mystery that goes with it, the banquets, the wine, the way that she's treating him, the way she's honoring him, buttering him up, everything she's doing is to make him more disposed to give her a favorable response. You know, by the time she actually puts her request to him, he will have said 3 times, I will give you whatever you want. It's going to make him lose face to now not do what she's going to ask, especially after she's given 2 banquets in his honor and she's been so respectful to him. Yeah, she's really shrewd. You see the irony of what she's doing.
Well,
She's doing to the king what his advisors were doing before. She is working herself into the place of one of those advisors. She's going to basically put herself in between the king and Haman. And she's going to be the one who controls what happens because she knows how to work this king and how to get him to respond the way that she wants. It is so shrewd what she's about to do when she ambushes Haman.
I still have another question, and that is, does Haman know that she's Jewish, or
No.
is that still secret?
He doesn't, and I don't think the king does either. No. So
It
there's
is
going to be a
really
total surprise to them. I mean, even when she says to the king, my people are about to be destroyed, he doesn't even know what she's talking about until she makes it clear it's Haman's edict that did it. So they have no idea she's a Jew, and she's going to use that to her advantage. It's great how she's going to pull a reversal on Haman. She's going to outsmart these 2 men, and they're not even going to know what she's doing until it's too late. Yeah, where did she get that kind of shrewdness? Well, maybe she's just shrewd to start with, but you know those 3 days of fasting made a difference. She's got a plan going into this about how she is going to get this king to respond the way that she wants.
well, and it reminds me of the feast especially, I think, is very symbolic in that in those 3 days of fasting, how the Lord may have spoke to her, and that given that we have the feast always following the fast of the resurrection, of the birth of Jesus, like Christmas is a feast following a fast, the Lent fast of 40 days following the resurrection. Like there are these symbolisms. It symbolizes when God shines his glory and when he appears and these purposes are revealed. That is a time of celebration of his promises, of his grace, of his like showing like the fruition of his design, like how its deliverance are on feast days. And so I think it's just very symbolic that like she has, as Marilyn said, this idea planted into her head. How did it get there? You know, like how, but there is like a plan working like behind the scene the whole time with that. And it also kind of reminds me of when I was little and how I would try to get some things from my dad. Like, don't ask him when he just got home from work or is out under the car. You know, you wait till his feet are up and you start giving him a little foot rub and you give him a butter sandwich and like you get them merry, you get them in a good mood, and all this, it all contributes to those purposes.
And she's, through the whole thing, she's been shrewd and smart, even when she was originally chosen as one to take the beauty treatments. She showed this intelligence from the very beginning, right? They took the beauty treatments, they did all that, and then when it was her time to go before the king, instead of taking from then on, I don't know how long it's been since she was named queen for this happened, that she has been probably watching and studying everything in the royal court and palace and picking out and knowing, what to do.
I really love it that she's chosen as a trophy wife. She's about to play this king like nobody's business. Yeah. Still no mention of God. How do you know he's there?
Because of the wisdom that he's given her in this plan of, at a loss for a word to describe her plan. But it's godly, obviously. God has given her the wisdom.
I think of what Amy just, based on what Amy just said, I think like that's how she responded to Mordecai as well. It's like, so, yeah, and he, no doubt had raised her to understand that. And she was a girl, but he taught her. Because she wanted books and things, right? Is that right?
I don't know.
Well, she obviously could read because he gave the edict to give to her.
Yeah.
And tell them, so he probably did teach her in ways that weren't, and like, she's manipulative, but not in a bad way.
Not coy.
No.
She's not coy, but she might.
She knows how to
that,
use
yeah.
the situation to her, and I think a lesson for all of us is like, there's a good point in learning and studying the people around you and knowing how to work with people and how to do what, manipulating isn't the right word because I don't want the negative impact of that, but you have to study, well, then how to work things best.
Part of her wisdom is that she didn't read into the whole room and all the people in time and the risk everything and go say them with the king and I'll do it but he's rushing him. She yells at the person herself and the people behind her, please with the Lord, to go before him and be patient before rushing in and taking the next step. And that takes a wise person not to rush in, it's away from the Lord who's been guided. Because an emergency is going to be, if you don't do this, the bad part will happen. And sometimes it's better to back off and not rush into the fire until you know what the Lord is directing you to do. Seeking God first.
There's this bit in Proverbs that says, we looked at this when we saw Ezra and Nehemiah. There's a bit in Proverbs that says that God turns the heart of the king like a watercourse to follow the way that he wants it to go. So underneath everything that Esther is doing, how do you know that God is there? Because he's turning the heart of the king the way that he wants it to go. When I look at this and I think, you have a king this bad, what do you need? You need a turnover of administration. That's what you need. You need a new leader. You need a better king. Well, God can do that. God can overthrow the king. He can replace the king. He can be done with the king in a snap if that's what he wants. But he doesn't have to do that. He can turn the heart of the king like a watercourse to go the way that he wants, and he's going to do it with this king. And it's not going to be dramatic. It's not going to be something that everybody's going to see. It's not going to be an overwhelming show of force. It's going to be really quiet, behind the scenes, mustard seed mode, but God is going to turn the heart of this king. And it's not just that he's going to turn it a different direction. He's going to turn it in the direction that will fulfill his ancient promises. So, the next chapter is my favorite bit. The time between the two banquets, when the coincidences pile up like crazy. It's not just the coincidences that show you that God is there. It's that there are ancient promises in the background that are being fulfilled by the way that God is orchestrating the circumstances. And he's going to do what he's going to do. And he is in control. Even though he looks like he's not there, you still get this sense when he never gets mentioned, like, where is he? Because nobody can see him. And yet we can already see him, can't we? Just under the surface, doing things that nobody notices. You kind of have to step back and look at the whole story to even appreciate how the coincidences line up. It's so subtle. But that's how powerful our God is. He doesn't have to have a big show of force. He can just turn the heart of the king the way that he wants it to go. And he's going to use Esther to do it. Well, any relevance for us?
I think it's exciting as we're looking at Esther. But as we look at Esther and all the things that she's doing, I'm just overwhelmed at how God is in control.
I was listening to something on the news last night. I can't even remember what it was. I just remember listening to it and just thinking, there are people in control who have no wisdom at all. And there's nothing I can do. I mean, I can go vote, I can do those kinds of things, but in a certain sense, I just feel helpless to change things that are crazy. And it's really tempting to start feeling like all these people are in control of me. Makes me angry. What could I do to... Are they really in control? Our God is in control of us. He might not take things exactly the way we would like today, but he is the one who's in control. Whatever it looks like on the surface, our God is the one who turns the hearts of people in the way that he wants it to go. And he will fulfill his ancient promises to us. There are promises that are relevant to us too, and he will keep his word to fulfill those.
Sally, when you watch the news, you need to have Psalm 2 open. Why do the nations rage and the people plot a vain thing? Kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord, against his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us. Verse 4, he who sits in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall hold them in derision.
Keep going.
Then
Don't
he
stop
shall-
before the good part.
Then he shall speak to them in his wrath and distress them in his deep displeasure. Yet I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion.
Might as well finish it.
Okay. I will declare the decree. The Lord has said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will give you the nations for your inheritance, and the ends of the earth for your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore be wise, O kings. He instructed you, judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way. When his wrath is kindled but a little, blessed are those who put their trust in him.
Amen.
Hallelujah.
Yeah. All right, that seems like a good place to stop.